the part that's hard to teach. Like, we all understand how to be outside. We all know how to camp. We all know how to make a campfire. We all know certain things. But I think the one thing I've taken from the Kalispel Tribe in 30 years is a reverence and a deep connection to the land and what it provides. And as a European descendant who had a dad who liked to be outdoors, I understood that. And when I came here, I knew I was in the right place.
Welcome to the Forest Overstory. I'm your host, Sean Alexander. The Forest Overstory is a podcast that provides insight and education into the field of forest management, helping landowners to become better stewards of their forest. The Forest Overstory was brought to you by the Society of American Foresters in the Inland Empire chapter. Welcome to the 6th episode. Man, I can't believe we're already on number 6 episode of the Forest Overstory podcast. Today we are joined by two foresters and natural resource professionals in Ponderay County. They work for the Kalispel Tribe of Indians. We're joined by Ray Entz and Mike Lithgow. I will let you guys introduce yourselves.
Sure, I'll go first. This is Ray. I'm the Director of Wildlife and Terrestrial Resources for the tribe. So I manage wildlife, forestry, fire, and archaeology for the tribe.
Yeah, and I'm Mike Lithgow, the Information Outreach Coordinator and Policy Analyst for KNRD. And I work with all of our departments trying to, help tell the Kalispel Tribe story to the community, to the region. And thanks for having us on today.
Yeah, appreciate it. So, as I was saying earlier with this conversation, there's kind of a lot of different ways we can take this. And one of the ways I want to get into in a little bit is going to be this conversation around traditional ecological knowledge. But before I get into that, Mike, you just said something interesting. You said your goal is to tell the story of the Kalispel Tribe. Do you want to give us, the synopsis? What do you mean by that story? What is that story that you want to tell?
Yeah, so, at KNRD, we do so many different things. We really, fight above our weight. We have a big impact on the landscape, and we have a lot of projects going on. So our project managers and our field level staff are incredibly busy doing good things for conservation, and they don't always have time to tell that story. And I think that is important, for people to know exactly what we're doing and why we're doing it, so that we can build support in the community. And oftentimes, you get so focused on the deliverables and the deadlines and the reporting, and you just don't have time to go to that meeting just to be there, to be part of the process. And it's an important role that often gets overlooked. And so back in 2016 is when I came on board. It was a longtime goal of Ray and Dean and Joe. They're the leaders of KNRD. They wanted to bring someone in like me that had good relationships in the community and could help tell that story. So that's pretty much it. That's what I do. I do a lot of other things too, other duties as assigned, like we all do. But that's a main role that I play.
Just so the listeners can get a sense of the scope of management, what is the acreage, the size of the amount of land that you guys help manage, and what are generally speaking, the objectives of management for the tribe?
Well, that's a good question. Scope. The tribe is situated on a very, very small reservation, 4,700 acres. Their Aboriginal territory or adjudicated land base is upwards of 2.3 million acres, and they were distributed across the entire Ponderay Clark Fork watershed to about Noxon, Montana, and all the way up into parts of British Columbia and in the Ponderay drainage. So it's interesting. So, you have a group of people that, subsisted on a pretty big landscape in much higher numbers than they are today, but then settlement change, they hunkered down and stayed in their traditional main winter village. And they were given opportunities and offers to move to larger reservations during the reservation period, both the Colville, Spokane, and Flathead reservations. And they said, no, this is our home and we're staying here. And so they kind of hunkered down and stayed out some pretty significant periods of time post treaty period and post reservation period. And in 1914, they were recognized by President Wilson by executive order and given a small 8 square mile area that was only occupied by them at the time as their reservation. Currently, the landscape that we own and manage is a little over 11,500 acres. So since my start with the tribe in the early 90s, we've been able to acquire a land base beyond the reservation for the purposes of conservation and a few more parcels over time for both economics and housing. So it's a mixed bag. And when you say what's the scope of our management or what is our goal, because our reservation is so small, it's hard to be a Kalispel on that minuscule acreage. There's not enough acreage to sustain their interaction and uses on the landscape. So our perspective from a tribe from this tribe is extrinsic more than intrinsic. So we don't really manage within the borders of the reservation as much as we do outside. And by that, I mean engage with the federal, state, local entities and agencies to reach what our conservation objectives and outcomes are. So, if to use one of our favorite vernaculars, a rising tide lifts all boats. So we work outside of the reservation to increase the conservation outcome in order to have benefits back to the reservation. So reservation's small. It is a special place because it basically has those special rights associated with it that the tribal members can use differently than they can off the reservation. So that's not to say that our tribal membership doesn't hunt, fish, gather off the reservation. They do that like any other citizen, and under the jurisdiction of the state, but where they can do that more in tune with their internal jurisdiction and understanding is that one special place, which is the reservation and all of the reserved rights that come with it. So I'm not sure that answered the entirety of your question because it's complicated. Take the Colville tribe, for instance. The Confederate Colvilles made up of 13 bands and occupy a reservation of 1.3 million acres. They don't have as much interest off the reservation as we do because they have enough land within the reservation to kind of have the meaningful outcomes they need to have from a conservation and management perspective to support their membership. And we don't.
So in terms of the goals that you guys are managing for, you said conservation, right, is one of those goals, but that's pretty high level. Can you provide maybe some more specific goals that you guys are managing for, both in terms of land, in terms of conservation, spiritual, cultural?
Yeah, conservation, right? So whether that's the berry crops of the year or the the deer availability, all of those things that supply individual Kalispel members and collectively the tribe with the resources they want or need. And those aren't just necessarily fish and wildlife things. So when we talk about forestry, forest management, and kind of that bigger landscape approach, it's really comes down to access and opportunity. So with a limited land base to be Kalispel, quote unquote, we basically, the membership extends their access and opportunities beyond that boundary to fill those needs. And so that could be spiritual, religious, food, medicine, structural components, tree species to revive a canoe culture that's coming back now. So it's wide ranging and it's hard to pin down. I mean, when you think about Native American uses of the landscape, it's not really dissimilar from anyone else or any landowner, because they really used it and use it the same way that we do today. Maybe from a different context, maybe from a different perspective, but much the same recreation, right? It's where they work, and it's where they play, and it's where they pray.
Yeah, I'd like to add a little bit to that as well. Is that the Kalispel people are very, very generous, and the opportunity to share conservation information and opportunities with non-Kalispel people is important to them as well. And we can talk about this later, as about the Indian Creek Community Forest and just the opportunity to have a public place where we can teach Kalispel and non-Kalispel, principles of conservation and why these species are important to us and why these landscapes are important to us. And that's it's an interesting place because the reservation is so small, and we have properties off the reservation, which is the Indian Creek Community Forest is one of those properties. And the river divides the reservation. The Ponderay River divides the reservation in two, and the school system that all the children go to is integrated. And so there's a sense of community that's really powerful and important. And I think that really leads to that generosity, and that concept of a rising tide lifts all boats is, not just we want Kalispel to be successful, and we will also want, the community of Cusick and the region to be successful, because that's going to make us all better.
Yeah, I really like that. I really like that phrase. I'm going to have to log that one away for another day. And the community forestry or forest model is something that I think is just so cool. And it touches on something that I feel like I've been hearing a lot more lately, which is around the idea of restoration. A lot of what we're doing right now is in forestry is trying to restore based on, degradation from a number of different things. And I'm really curious to hear your guys' take, from the perspective of the Kalispel Tribe on restoration and the importance of incorporating humans in that process. There's a term that I've heard recently called biocultural restoration that basically speaks to that. The idea that we can't think of restoration simply as going back to a time and place when, the nature just lived on its own and was perfect, and humans somehow weren't involved, which is a totally ignorant narrative, right? We're learning, we're finally kind of flipping the script there and talking about how humans have managed, specifically tribes, have managed the forest for millennia. So I'm really curious how restoration fits into everything that you're doing.
It's really everything we do. But we have, we're not So we're not activists. We're advocates, and through that philosophical underpinning of the tribe being that generous space, being the viewing themselves as part of a community as opposed to an isolate from the community, right? Restoration is important, and we look at it as use all the tools necessary to get the conservation outcomes that we want. That means that, we use the saw as a restorative tool. That means we use, a hodad to plant trees as a restorative tool, or a, tract excavator as a restorative tool. So it's really kind of having a good description of what the landscape needs, having the data to support that, right, and then interjecting from a science perspective the smart ways to restore landscapes and, habitat types, those kinds of things, opportunities. And when you talk about restore, one of the biggest things we're trying to restore is access, right? Access for our tribal membership to use those resources. And it's different on the different flavors of lands that are out there and accessible to the tribal membership.
So I know that your guys' organization or your tribe has slowly acquired land over time. What has been one of the major factors that you've seen degraded that you've had to work in terms of conserving or restoring as you've bought these parcels of land?
That's a tough question, because I think it's not so much that there's things that are missing as much as the opportunity of access is relatively small right now. And so finding those places that can support those resources that are important, whether they be food, medicinal, structural, kinds of things. So it's really going back, like our strategy for, say, land acquisition is trying to buy parcels of land or acquire parcels of land that have the potential to provide a resource. So let's just take a really basic one for the Kalispel people, and that's camas. Camas is kind of one of those principal starch staples that grows in wetlands and floodplain areas, and exists today much like it did, pre-contact. But land use changes through, Western, transition to Western culture has, changed the soil compaction or the hydrologic regime of that particular piece of land, and has made it less conducive to camas growth. So we know that. So we can focus on that particular piece of land and try to restore some of that project or property specific hydrology or soil decompaction or wetland restoration to support a more abundant camas crop than existed before. And we as a European society have a tendency to want to change everything to what we think it should be, as opposed to trying to embrace what it is and what it provides currently. We don't have, house sparrows and starlings because we didn't bring them with us. We brought them with us because they reminded us of home, and that's what we wanted. We didn't bring them because they were some benefit to the ecosystems that we were newly occupying. So that imperialistic sort of revolutionary sort of perspective of a European settler type perspective is we can grow corn here. Well, corn's not native to the Ponderay Valley, or we can grow wheat here. we had canvas. That was really the principal starch available to the tribes. So why grow potatoes if you already have one?
Another thing we often do is we will acquire properties that have upland components that have not seen fire in a really long time. The Kalispel were historically have put fire on the ground every year on places they would occupy, and so the species that were there that were important to them were used to that fire regime, and so we do as much prescribed burning as we can. It can be challenging depending on the landscape and the seasons. We have a pretty tight windows in this part of the world, but once we get that fire back down, it's amazing the restoration powers of fire. And so it's we have just like the floodplains. Maybe they've been ditched and drained, and we come back and we restore the wetlands and we restore the floodplains so that we can have the camas. We bring in the fire. It helps with huckleberry in certain areas. It promotes species like white pine and ponderosa pine and lodgepole pine. These species that are more resilient and that are important culturally. So those are some of the things that we do when we acquire land.
I'm glad you brought up fire because this is something I'm really curious about. I mean, I know, indigenous use of fire is well recorded. I mean, it's been used for, again, millennia. And we know in the last century or more, fire exclusion has led to all kinds of problems. We don't have to explore that again. I think we did that in the first podcast. But, what I'm curious is on, Kalispel lands or other tribes, did fire just continue to be used through that period? Did they ever stop? Was there fire exclusion as well? I'm just kind of curious what the history is there.
Probably not well understood. We know what the traditional knowledge, perspective is for the use of fire. We know the kinds of things that the tribe used for fire, and I'm pretty sure they, as settlement was happening in the West and in this area, they probably still practiced as they did with or without a reservation or a home, I guess a traditional homeland. But, that's not to say that after a while, once settlement became towns and started to become more sophisticated, that, people put them out. I mean, that's kind of what we do. Put the fire out, right? Fire's bad. And if fire's bad, we got to put it out. And so there's been a change, I think, in over time, and that probably when numbers were less dense, as there probably was some acceptance for the use of fire and it continued on the landscape. But then as population densities increased, especially around the reservation and where the tribal members were and were using landscape tools like fire, it probably changed rapidly. I'm sure people got incensed when folks were lighting fires in the fall to burn off the berry patches and whatever.
Yeah. Are there any written records of the practice of fire, maybe instructions, or you're nodding your head or shaking your head here?
No. So no written piece, right? The only writing that has happened from that perspective is happening now, and probably over the last 20 to 30 years.
What about verbal stories? Because I know that's kind of the big way. Can you provide an example? Do you know of any stories that were shared?
Not particularly with fire, but it was an oral tradition and an oral knowledge base. And so stories were one way to tell, parables or, lessons. But something like fire would be similar to a salmon chief, assigning responsibilities and catch rates for different folks at a particular fishery, right? So Not necessarily a story, but just a passed down center of knowledge. So you had these people that were in charge of something, whether they were a hunting chief or a gathering person, or, a chief or a salmon chief. Those folks basically were the ones that everybody looked to pass that knowledge on to the younger folks and to kind of be that center of knowledge. And that was just passed down from elder to the next person in line. So not necessarily a story driven process of learning in those particular instances. I'm sure that was just, I was a living manual and I passed my knowledge down to the next person, as a matter of everyday sort of transition.
That's really fascinating. I mean, it sounds like you're saying that it was just so ingrained that it basically wasn't worth telling, not worth telling a story about it, but it was just part of life. Kind of just didn't make the headlines because it was so ingrained in what they did, which is really interesting.
Right. They, things like creation story and origin story and how salmon were, made unavailable to the Kalispel people past a certain point. Those are all sort of parable, mythology, right? That's the kind of stuff of story. But then there was just that other set of knowledge base that was just recounted every year and passed on from generation to generation, so that those pieces wouldn't go with no written language. That's how they, that's just how they had to do it.
I think to let me take this on a philosophical rift, it's interesting nowadays where we're in this era of social media, era of technology, everything can be recorded, everything can be written down. And we don't quite have that same level of reverence or respect or need for elders to have that share of knowledge and share of transfer through the community. Not to say we don't need it, in general, but it's interesting looking at, Native American, that culture, because they really, like, community was so essential for them, it seems like, and not just community within their own, but also between different tribes, because there was quite the share of resources and knowledge that transferred between them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. If you have an abundance of camas and you don't have regular access to a large salmon fishery, you have to interact with your neighbors to avail of all the various resources that you need to, subsist through time.
So the Kalispel, for anybody who's not from the area, you guys are located in, I'm going to butcher, it's Cusick, correct? That's the area of Ponderay?
Yeah, it's about 20 miles north of Newport, Washington.
Okay.
Kind of juxtaposed on the opposite side of the river of the towns of Cusick and Usk. So it's about, 20 miles north of the Idaho-Washington border, where the Ponderay River crosses and sort of starts to meander north from that point.
And does the Ponderay River, does that connect to the Spokane River?
No, it's a second largest tributary to the Columbia River.
Okay, but it is a tributary, and I'm guessing it's after the dam, after the the Grand Coulee.
No, so if you think about the Upper Columbia, sort of Chief Joseph Dam and Grand Coulee Dam blocked anadromous fish to the Upper Columbia, and so the Chief Joseph Dam, I believe, is kind of down by Brewster, spans from the Colville Reservation across to Washington State side. Grand Coulee, it's the same. It's located half on Colville Reservation, half on the state of Washington. And then as you proceed upstream, you come to the Spokane River, and then the Ponderay River, where it dumps into the Columbia in Canada. So just across the border in Canada. And then you continue, up into Canada to like Mica Dam and Arrow Lakes dams, and you kind of up to the canal flats and the headwaters.
Because I know bull trout was a major fish resource that a lot of tribes really needed. I'm assuming that was similar for the Kalispel?
Probably more so important than salmon as a recurring resource, just because of the distance to procure salmon. The tribe had one known owned fishery, which is a Samo River in Canada, and they traveled to both Kettle Falls and Spokane Falls to those fisheries that were owned by the Spokane and Colville tribes, and were invited participants to those fisheries. But if you think about calorically putting away fish flesh as a different protein source, a 25-pound bull trout was important. 10-pound, 8-pound cutthroat was important. Suckers, whitefish, important, very important.
Can you give us this breakdown? You said that the Kalispel tribe had covered this area of 2.3 million acres across the inland Northwest, extending from Washington to Montana up into Canada. Can you just kind of give us this short little history background of the I guess I'm trying to see how to phrase this question, kind of the distribution of the tribe. I mean, there's this talk about like Salish, and I don't fully understand the concept of Salish because I think it's more of like a language, I think. And how were the interactions maybe with the Colville, which you just kind of talked about with trading. So could you kind of give us a little bit of a story here of the history of the tribe and what were their distinctions from some of the others?
Boy, you're gonna put me in a tough spot. It's so the Salish language family is a large family of languages, and they're all very similar. So there's different dialects of Salish, and you can there's some downloadable maps you can get of indigenous languages, and you can, if you pay attention to how they kind of distribute across the landscape, you can kind of see, where tribes lived and occupied. And so the Kalispel language is part of the Salish group, but Salish is really kind of like a proto language to Spokane. Some of the different Colville band languages like Lakes and the Inchelian band and Nespelan band, Moses band. So there's connection, right? So if you have the same base language, the words translate, right? So Kalispel word for, I'm going to try to get this right, king salmon is sumklich or sumkli. In Spokane, it's sumklich. So there's, pronoun, so there's differences, but the base word, the sort of that proto word, sumkli, is translatable across those tribes. So they could talk to one another, even though their dialects were different. Maybe not, just like talking to your relatives, you don't probably always understand them, but, you can get the gist of things that they're talking about, depending on where they're from. Mine are from Pennsylvania, so I rarely understand what they're talking about.
That's right. Yeah. And I go home and I think I've lost my Midwest accent because too many Ojaders and I just don't know what they're talking about. But I did want to know or share for the listener that there's a really interesting land map. You probably are familiar with this. It's the native-land.ca. It's a website that you can actually go and see where, which tribes, which languages, what territories existed in your area. And it's awesome. I've really enjoyed it. It's a great way to get the lay of the land, exactly what you were talking about, Sean. And I'm kind of curious, Ray or Mike, is there a place where listeners could go to learn more specifically about the Kalispel, like, some of those oral traditions and some of the stories that you were talking about?
Well, I mean, we have some information, quite a bit of information on the Kalispel Tribe's website on the KNRD portion, but the stories and those are a little more complex. I mean, some stories are only told in certain times of year, and so they have some significant cultural components that aren't shared in they're in very many with everybody all the time. So there's some importance there that we try to be very respectful of. But yeah, so I don't think there's anywhere on our web platforms where we share story information. It's kind of kept a little bit closer than that. But
Sure.
Yeah.
And with our language restoration that's happening right now, there is some of that sort of more generic storytelling that's been translated to help teach the language. And that's been accessible to, most of the kids that are enrolled in the early childhood programs here, native or not. So there are non-native Kalispel speakers now. Right. And that's a really powerful story, is the restoration of that language. And when we talked about, stories and knowledge transfer, not being a written language and being sort of subjugated from your language during, the 20s, 30s, and 40s, like they were beaten for speaking their language. Those pieces of knowledge were lost. And with them, parts of the language. And so this restoration project spans more than just Kalispel Tribe. It includes the Spokane, it includes the Confederate Salish and Kootenai tribes as Salish speakers, to share all of their elder knowledge that is possible to rebuild this, Kalispel and Salish together on a broader scheme. So today's Kalispel is probably not like it was pre-contact, because it, through time, it's just been necessary to, expand that knowledge base into other dialects to try to recreate that base Salish understanding and knowledge. So, but it's a really cool thing that's been going on for at least a decade or more at the Kalispel Tribe and the Spokane Tribe and Confederate Salish and Kootenai, just working together to try to rebuild Salish.
And one thing we've tried to do with the language program is try to insert some natural resource curriculum into the immersion language program. So they teach everything in Kalispel, which is really powerful. So these kids are conversational. They're very fluent, and they teach science. They teach biology and math in Kalispel. So we're working on a program right now that really provides them a more conservation based program that talks about invasive species, endangered species, the habitats they depend on, and really kind of blend that into their daily activities in the immersion program. So we're really excited about that.
That's and I'm really glad you said that, because I was just about to ask, what kind of, in terms of knowledge transfer and thinking about tribal youth, and what kind of efforts were underway to raise the next crop of tribal foresters and wildlife biologists and stuff, that, people that can go off and learn and then come back and manage the lands that they grew up on. I imagine that could be a very difficult thing to try to retain. Everybody deals with brain drains, and so I imagine that's happening on the tribe as well.
It is. I have conversations with the executive director for WFFA a lot, Elaine O'Neill,
Sure.
about the same struggles with small forest landowners and passing on that generational love and knowledge to the next generation to care for that land. And they struggle with it. The same as the tribe struggles with it. It's 2022, and there's a lot more opportunity for tribal members today than natural resource careers or careers in firefighting, wildland firefighting, and those used to be the big draw. When I started in the early '90s, that's where people wanted to work. The young men, the young women wanted to, work with us, shocking fish or putting in, log weirs in the stream or be on the 20-man wildland firefighting crew. That's not the case anymore. The opportunities for education are so much more advanced now for tribal members. The world is their oyster. They have the opportunity to do anything they want. And, unfortunately, we're just not the big sexy anymore. And it's troublesome at times to think about who is that person, who are those folks that are going to step up and take over that leadership role or that role and carry those traditional knowledge and that implementation into the future, because I am no spring chicken. I'm not old yet, but I'm no spring chicken.
One of the things that I see for people that are coming into this field are students who engage in natural resources as a child. So maybe, their family were hikers or, and actually where I was kind of taking this point was maybe their parents were hunters. And I know hunting was a huge practice for many tribes. Do you guys actively lead youth hunting engagements on your tribal grounds?
So we do. We do not at this time, but we actually have been working with our summer youth program, and we're going to teach a hunter ed program to all of the middle school summer youth, and hopefully the high school as well, because a lot of them get so busy with sports, and if this is part of their summer youth curriculum. And we've got great support from our tribal council on this. So we're going to, we've got some of our staff are certified hunter ed instructors. So even if they're not interested in hunting, it's just a really good baseline of firearm safety. Lots of homes have hunting rifles in them. And so we want to make sure people are safe and there's a conservation component of that, how hunting is part of the conservation model in North America. We're building that, and this will be the first year that we do that program. But a lot of it is, like Ray was saying, the world is, they've got a lot of opportunity in the big world outside of the reservation, outside of conservation. But opportunities like today, we just got an opportunity from Washington State University. They have a new scholarship program for forestry for Native American students, and so I shared that with our Camas Learning Center program. And, it's a big deal. That's a lot of money. And I think that, the more we can get those kids, we can get them hooked young, we can recruit them and retain them and keep them engaged through, and then get them into a program like this that WSU offers. We're hopeful we can build that. It's in process and it's very challenging, but that's our goal.
Yeah, we need to do our best to make forestry the big sexy again, like Ray said. I never understood. I mean, it was the big sexy for me. I was really interested right from the beginning, but I guess there's, not everybody is as excited about it. I understand. And we definitely want everybody to pursue whatever they're passionate about. But it's really important, I think, that we, across the board try to instill passion for nature and forests, because we all know that they're going to be facing more challenges than ever in the next few decades. So,
yeah, that's a great point. I think when you look at technology advances and where kids are today, is that we are literally losing human connection to the landscape on a rapid pace, where kids don't even know what the outside is anymore. It's a virtual world of playing Minecraft or whatever, Fortnite, whatever the hot game is today. But some of these kids are just completely disenfranchised from the ecological world. And that is troubling because, I mean, I grew up in a house that was, my dad was a killer. He was a hunter. And he was breaking ground in the 50s that just, today seems kind of meh, we all do it. But he was part of a cadre of guys that was, at the time resurrecting archery hunting as a sport in Washington. And there was a handful of them. And so I have paper clippings of my dad, hunting in the Blue Mountains. Basically him and his cadre, and that was it. Nobody else used archery at that time. And so he was kind of part of that resurgence of that hunting type. But it seems silly today. He did what? That we all archery hunt. Not a big deal. It was a big deal for him. It was a big deal for his guys. I mean, I've got stories of him hunting with Fred Bear and his entourage, just kind of on happenstance meetups and, in the Blue Mountains. It's kind of cool.
So I'm curious because right now, one of the big things that I've been seeing is as we've been in this kind of technological revolution, at the same time, you're also seeing a growing component of people who are realizing that they're in this, society is right there, or all the resources are right there at your whim. Go to Walmart, get your chicken, and that's not really healthy. And so there's been this new kind of growth of the homesteaders, the people that are kind of looking for that subsistence lifestyle. And I think that that's really something that if we were to peer into the history and knowledge and information of the tribes, I mean, you guys did it better than anybody else. And so hopefully, I think that's what I kind of want to take out of this episode today is, what can we, as a broad society, take back to our own personal lives and be able to implement, and then also how can we give back to the tribes and be able to help them restore their communities that have been so degraded over the last 150 years.
Again, a good perspective. The part that's hard to teach, like we all understand how to be outside. We all know how to camp. We all know how to make a campfire. We all know certain things. But I think the one thing I've taken from the Kalispel Tribe in 30 years is a reverence and a deep connection to the land and what it provides. And as a European descendant who had a dad who liked to be outdoors, I understood that. And when I came here, I knew I was in the right place. My concern for and my ethic and it was like a matching set for the tribe. And I knew that it was the right place, because it's different, right? It's just different. There are a lot of people that share it. That there's no doubt that there's a ton of people out there that share it, but there's a lot that don't get it. They'll come and hike on a trail in the city park, but they don't really understand that deep sort of connective tissue that the landscape provides us. I mean, heck, there's doctors out there that are writing prescriptions for going outside, right? That's how crazy this world has become, is that now there's a prescription-based medical professional going, you need to go outside and connect with nature. You need to pick up a pine cone, right? And so what Mike talks about in telling that story is providing the landscape to do that. A space. Indian Creek Community Forest is a space that we've created with the permission of the tribe to engage everyone in a natural resource education perspective and just connecting with it. What is fire history? What is a fire resilient tree? Why is that? Why is a ponderosa pine more fire resilient than a grand fir? Right? And we can describe those on the landscape. We can describe those on a trail with a signage or an interactive tour or whatever that is. And so that's been a really cool piece that we've been able to kind of share. And that, I'll let Mike talk about that, but it's cool.
Yeah. So let's see, how do I phrase this? I feel like the Kalispel and many tribes bring this perspective that's very pragmatic, and it's kind of opposite of the man. I love wilderness areas. I utilize wilderness areas. I mean, there's some amazing opportunity, but in the Wilderness Act, it talks about a place where man is just a visitor, and that's never really been true. And so the Kalispel, they pragmatically utilize the landscape. They take care of it, and it takes care of you, because there's so many resources out there that we may not need them today, but they are good for us. They are really good for us. And back in the day, you needed it. That was what, if you didn't know how to use it, it was not going to be pretty. So I like to tell that story to the kids that come from Spokane, and they're just like, we look at the hides and the horns, and we talk about animals and utilization of animals. And animals are important. They're really important just because they are, but they're also important because of the hides they provide us and the meat they provide us. And like that perspective, I think, is often lost in urban environments. They just don't think about the practical use of trees, the practical use of all of these tools that we have that we can gather on the landscape. And when we talk about Indian Creek, I try to weave that story in, as best I can, depending on the group every time, because it may feel like a wild place. I mean, we have wolves and bears and cougars out there. I mean, and we're only 6 miles from town, but I mean, it's a highly manipulated landscape. We're out there doing pre-commercial thinning. We're doing, we're logging when necessary. We're restoring the stream. And so we're putting a lot of inputs. It's only there because we want it to be there, because we bought it to conserve it and improve it. And that's the same thing with with the rest of our public lands. If we don't appreciate them, and we don't understand that the investment they may not be there. So I think the Kalispel understand that better than most, and that's why I'm here.
Yeah, I really feel like you hit the nail on the head, because it's just so important that we start reframing it, that we're not just visitors to nature, like you said. I love wilderness areas too, but I think that narrative that, this idea that you can just go to somewhere where man has never been, and they're just it's just going to be some virgin forest, totally untainted, that just doesn't exist. And we have to start framing it that we're a part of this, and that's okay too, right? We have an impact, and we can control our impact, and we can do things in a sustainable way, and we can manipulate a forest to produce the things that are valuable to the community. That's so important. And I also think it's important for engagement, because I think if you're bringing someone from the city, like kids or something that don't know much about this, if they're just passing through, like they're looking in a museum, just observing instead of participating, I don't think that's going to engage them. It's just really not. I was very fortunate. I grew up in the suburbs, not in the woods or anything, but there was a 20-acre woodlot nearby that I now know I was trespassing on. But I would go out there, I would make maps, I would dig holes, I would turn over logs. Lucky I never got caught, but it's the reason I think, I'm in forestry, and we need to give those opportunities to the kids today, because, 80% of people live in urban areas now. That number is only growing. And that's why I think this community forest that you're talking about is such a cool model. And I'm really glad. I mean, it sounds like it's successful, right? It's been a pretty good success so far.
Yeah, except for COVID.
Well,
You
yeah.
know, I mean, our trajectory with the Indian Creek Community Forest and the outreach and kind of the participation was starting to take off, and then nobody can go see each other anymore, and we're all relegated to a 2D world. Um, it didn't help. so
Yeah.
so we're almost restarting with the community forest as we come out of this pandemic and kind of transition to more of a normal-ish world. But I think I want to reflect back on what you said about wilderness. That's never been the case, right? When
Yeah.
people think about, when we fantasize about, we wilderness and, oh, I'm going to walk in a space that's never been walked before, or I'm going to see something that nobody's ever seen before. That's hooey. That's just literal hooey. There's no such thing. And man has been an integral part of nature since, day one. And as populations grow, and our, insults to nature grow with it, that's where I think, working for a tribe, working in natural resources is really kind of cool, because we get to try to stave off all of that pressure, to try to continue to provide a legacy that future generations can enjoy. And we're right, I think, at a point in time, at a precipice moment, right, that we have opportunities and tons of them. There's money, there's time, there's care, but if enough people in enough places don't act together to, or collaborate to move the needles and to, protect the land, or to restore the land, or to conserve the land and the species that are supported by it, we have a serious start to a roller coaster ride that's epic, not good.
I had a person that I worked briefly with. His name was Doug McKay. He was one of the foresters down in the Southern Oregon, Lake County, the Fremont, Wainema area. And that was during my master's, and we were looking at diameter distribution of historic tree structure in these frequent pine, frequent fire ecosystems. And I was talking with Doug one day, about how the ecosystem would have come to this shape, and should we be managing it towards that shape. And one thing I learned about Doug, or one thing he told me, was Doug was not a forester. His background was actually in anthropology. And so he had a history of looking at human societies, and particularly Native American societies. And so he turned me on to the fact that at the time, I mean, estimates ranged anywhere between 2 million Native Americans, upwards of some of the high end estimates of 18, 20, 25, even higher estimates, million Native American people on the landscape at that time frame. And so if you look at like how many people that was, and how much they utilized the landscape, I mean, there was a massive influence on what our native ecosystems would have looked like. And I had another mentor, actually. His name's Mark Swanson at Washington State University. And he was the one that actually first taught me how to hunt. And I wasn't really sure at the time why I was getting into hunting. It was just kind of like, oh, that's cool. And so we were talking, and he kind of turned me on to this philosophy that when you hunt, what you're doing is you're creating a narrative to your food. That instead of being disconnected from the necessary resource that you have, you start to understand the amount of energy that goes into producing that necessary item, that necessary resource. And I think that's so interesting, because we're really good at taking resources, but we're not as good about taking the effort to maintain those resources and putting that same amount of energy back into the landscape. So I'm curious, I actually want to like turn this into a question then for Mike, especially. What are you guys doing on your landscape? Are you guys actively managing for any wildlife species? Are you guys doing any population studies? Are there any cool projects like that? Because I know that it's a common thing.
Yeah, I'll hit on a few, and Ray is really knowledgeable on a lot of the studies that we're doing as well. The we are really focusing. We focus a lot on native fish recovery, which is important with those bull trout, West Slope cutthroat, the mountain whitefish, and suckers. They were all super important, and so those riparian landscapes are we do a lot of work in those areas. We to restore the floodplain connectivity. That has a huge benefit for native amphibians. We're doing some work on invasive species control through bullfrog control mostly. I mean, there's a lot of bullfrogs on the landscape, and they are hard on native amphibians. So we're doing a lot of work for that. We're engaged on a lot of different efforts, on the wildlife side, and I'll let Ray talk about that as well. But yeah, there's we have a pretty. We're small, but we have a lot of capacity. We're a pretty big crew. We have over 40 to 50 seasonal employees, and a lot of those, and we have techs that are doing stream work and wildlife work as well. Do you want to talk about some of the wildlife stuff we're doing, Ray?
Yeah, to answer your question, we don't do a lot of species specific studies. We do some monitoring. We have sort of a large rotational monitoring program. So we do some things like long-term trend analysis with amphibian populations and neotropical migratory bird populations. We haven't gotten into like ungulate. It's a different beast, right? So we have tons of fishery programs that, inventory lakes and inventory species and rivers and that kind of thing constantly. Well, fish don't generally get out of the water and walk around, but deer don't stay in Washington and certainly don't stay on the Kalispel Indian Reservation very long. So they're moving all the time. And so developing and designing population studies for, these large generalist predators, et cetera, is really difficult. But technology is changing all the time. So, there's new tools available to us through genetics that you can do mark recapture studies on large ungulate populations you couldn't do before. We have FLIR, forward looking infrared, where you can get up in a plane and just count animals on a transect because you can see their heat signatures and well enough in some cases to speciate. So as those tools grow, I think that the opportunity to do more of that kind of work is going to happen for the tribe, but currently no. But we're going to have to lean on our partners to help with that because we're not going to be successful on our own. It's going to take DFW, Fish and Wildlife Service, tribes working together just because there's just too much of a limited set of resources and human capacity to pull all that off alone. So if I have $2 million to spend, I don't think I'm going to spend it all on a deer study, but I might co-fund something with the Department of Fish and Wildlife or Idaho Fish and Game to do a broader look into that and help cost share that. But there's just so many priorities. It's difficult to do that. And just, furry critters that run around on the landscape just are hard to tackle. Like, let's do a porcupine study. Okay. They're tough to find to begin with.
Yeah. So given that many of our listeners are small forest landowners, what are your forest management actions translate to in terms of kind of managing and maintaining your wildlife species?
So I equate the Kalispel Tribe to a small forest landowner, right? Our landscape is not large enough for us to be considered like a industrial scale forest manager. So we're really, I think, in that same wheelhouse because we have some of the same responsibilities. We have a responsibility to a community, but we also have a responsibility to individual tribal members that own land that is in trust. And there's a fiduciary responsibility to them for the resources that occur on their land that are worth money. So trees are worth money. And so there's a whole process for entering a an allottee's piece of land as opposed to a tribal tract of land. And we manage them very differently. We manage individual Indian lands more for profit than for habitat, but we do have some forest practices basically that we don't go below, so that there's always a component of the different resource values that the stand provides. And then on the reservation or tribally owned pieces, we basically just focus on forest health, species composition, large diameter trees, and wildlife habitat. We have several fee title parcels that are conservation parcels, and we manage specifically for habitat.
What's the kind of general breakdown between tribally owned and privately owned on the reservation?
So the reservation is all in trust, so basically all
Right.
owned by the United States government on behalf of the Kalispel Indian community. And inside that reservation, about 50% belongs to the tribe and about 50% belong to individual tribal members or other native people. So it's a mixed bag. And it's not, it's checkerboarded just like a state owned, you got private industrial land, small forest landowners, Forest Service, county. It's just as complicated, but kind of fun because the values and resource engagement pieces that we use to go in are a little different than, say, a traditional Washington State forest practice application.
That's funny because that like checkerboarding can be, obviously it's a huge challenge, right? And it can lead to things like fragmentation and stuff, but it also can be an opportunity to have just a diverse, like a great horizontal diversity or landscape level diversity. That's one of the things that I think small forest owners in general bring to the table that, industrial timber companies don't. It's just that diversity of goals leads to a diverse set of forests. So, challenge and an opportunity. But I'm curious, you said that the individually owned parcels tend to be managed more commercially. Is that on behalf of the individual? That's kind of their behest? That just tends to be more their goals?
Yeah. In Indian country, everything that has a value is kind of managed very differently, especially since the Cobell case and the huge amount of mismanagement of Indian funds, individual Indian money that was mismanaged by the Bureau. So, there's a whole new department in the Bureau, the Office of Special Trust. There's all these rules. Well, trees, a gas lease, an oil lease, a grazing lease, they all have a value to the people that own that particular allotment. So, these things are checkerboarded, but when we go in to treat a stand, we treat the stand, and it might be partly on an allotment, and it might be partly on a tribal tract. And so the end result of that stand dynamic when it's done is going to be different across that line, but we're really starting that treatment based on a need, right? Whether it's a disease need, forest health need, hazard fuel reduction need.
That's interesting.
You were saying earlier that the tribe reminds you a lot of small forest land ownership, or small forest land ownership reminds you a lot of tribal ownership. I'm curious because you guys were talking earlier about prescribed fire, and that's something that I know many landowners are interested in applying on their land. However, there are a lot of challenges there. So can you talk to us a little bit about some of the challenges that the tribe has in terms of applying prescribed fire on your land and also just on the small parcels of your land?
I think it's the same challenge that the small forest landowner community faces and the state or the feds. There's a certain amount of risk associated with prescribed burning. If your fire doesn't do what you planned it to do, then, there's a risk associated with that. So having qualified staff on hand, equipment on hand to be able to mitigate that potential risk is important. And what I guess everybody's learning now that the state has geared up with their new, budget provisos that came out of the last legislature with the 1168, the Forest Health Initiative, and the fire initiatives that they've been able to get funded through DNR. Now there's money to do some of this, but guess what? There's not the capacity, and so we're kind of behind the curve in building that qualification and capacity to provide that service, both on the reservation and then, sort of community wide through DNR, Forest Service, etc. So, there's only so many qualified burn bosses out there. And how do we get more? Well, we have to add the classes. Well, there's only 4 slots, and there's 18 federal and state employees that need those 4 spots. And so we need to up the capacity of the training system to get the qualifications in place. So networking with our local DNR to get trainings available and get our folks, slots in those training opportunities, partnerships through like the Washington Resource Council and the TREX system. So that training, fire training, shared exercise that's going on. Those have been huge benefits to the tribe because we're trying to replace a piece of capacity that retired. And we've been having, then COVID on top of that, it's been really difficult to get the right classes, get our people trained, have enough people on the ground to meet the mitigation standard for prescribed burn. Add on top of that, this is the Pacific Northwest and weather plays. And our windows are generally, 3 to 6 weeks, depending on weather in both the spring and the fall. So you have different objectives for a spring burn than you do a fall burn. And so if winter or fall comes early, it just shuts you down. If it's too dry and hot too long, you can't burn. So there's, statewide burn bans. So there's a lot of complexity with pulling off prescribed burns. And that's even more complicated for a small forest landowner that doesn't have the resources. They can't afford to hire a burn boss and a 20-person crew and 2 engines to burn their 20 acres or their 10 acres. And I think that Commissioner Franz's vision was that DNR would be able to have that capacity and support that opportunity at some level. But, they're up against the wall too, and trying to raise the bar internally with the amount of capacity they need to take care of their own lands, let alone other landowners.
So Mike, are you going to get out there with a drip torch now?
Probably not, but I do provide support. I'm red carded. I'm more of a, whatever they tell me to do, fill in the gaps. But the challenge, we have a burn that we want to do on Indian Creek this spring, and we've been planning it for 2 years. And it's like just all the reasons that Ray said. It's been really challenging to get it off the ground, but I think we're there, and we want to have that demonstration burn out there so that people can understand, and we can tell that story about how important prescribed fire is, and make the habitat better. But it's part of that piece of that's going to be burned is part of a bigger effort to have a demonstration forest that we can have small forest landowners come out and walk around an interpretive trail that shows them different techniques of reducing fuels on the land. So that's a really exciting project that we're working with the WTA on. DNR, Andy from WSU has offered to help too. So, it takes a village to make these kind of big projects happen, and we want everybody to be engaged because we want you guys to use it. We want, we want to have workshops out there and have people come out there and walk it informally and just, learn on their own. But it's going to be a pretty great demonstration forest when it's done.
So to go ahead and kind of wrap up today's conversation, since we're talking about some examples that you guys are doing, you guys just recently took a contract, correct, with the U.S. Forest Service to manage like a 40,000 acre parcel. Am I saying that right?
Well, kind of.
Kind of.
So
Perfect. You're here to tell me that's right.
So through the Tribal Forest Protection Act, which was passed back in 2004, it was an authority that the feds gave tribes to partner with, and basically offer a project to the Forest Service that they would take on. In the past, the TFPA process has been implemented by tribes by taking completed Forest Service planning documents and then going and doing the sale or doing the stewardship work or whatever that was. We took a very different approach. We drew a big boundary across a bunch of watersheds that surround the reservation and tribal property to create a community-oriented view of management of our landscape. And so while our Tribal Forest Protection Act only applies to the 40,000 acres of Forest Service land within that big blob, it encompasses over 90,000 acres of private timberlands, small forest landowners, DNR, and the reservation itself. And it was that all hands, all lands approach concept to drawing that line. That came about from a single question from our tribal leadership after the 2015 tower fire. And that was, are we doing enough with our neighbors to protect the reservation and our residents? And the answer was no. But we had a tool. And so that spawned that Tribal Forest Protection Act project submission to the region, and ultimately took on that 40,000 acre Forest Service project. And we decided to involve the Washington Department of Natural Resources, GNA government, the GNA crew. I guess they call themselves the Federal Lands Division in DNR. So the Good Neighbor Authority is just another tool. So we thought, if we have the Forest Service, the tribe, and the DNR working together, we can probably treat the landscape more holistically than if it was just the Forest Service alone, or just the tribe alone, or just the DNR alone. Because the Forest Service struggles most significantly with sales when they don't have access. And they don't really like to take on temporary access to get into a unit. They want permanent long-term access. Well, through GNA, the state can just take that sale and do it under a road use permit and get the sale done, treat the stands, and then come out. And I think, we just recognized that we would lose a lot of potential treatment indicated as necessary by the science if we didn't have a broad sort of all-encompassing partnership in that project. So we've completed the NEPA, and we've completed the first 3 areas for sale units, and the first sale will go to bid this spring.
So is the focus primarily around fire mitigation? Or are there areas of that you've identified as potentially cultural or spiritual sites that you have other objectives for?
The main emphasis was forest health, and sort of that fire resiliency, forest health. So looking at our stands and what they need to be more resilient to both fire and to provide the resources that are necessary out there. So it really was a deep dive into the data and the science, and trying to come up with a project that took into account everything from cultural resources to low elevation winter range and everything in between. So it was a big bite. I probably burnt up some human beings and our relationships in the process, but we got through it, and I think we did a really, really good job. And I'm looking forward to the implementation and how our vision kind of comes out on the ground, where we react to today's information as much as we did the information when we developed the plan.
I'd like to add, I think the relationships also were improved in some cases. I think on with our partners, like coming to the table and being like, we're not just here to tell you what to do. We're going to roll up our sleeves and do it with you. And then taking all that to the community in a very deliberate, um, way on the front end before the NEPA was even started, and getting input from our community on things like that they really care about, like recreation, like ATV access, like finishing this loop trail over here or this boat launch that sucks. So we were able to, I think, gain some big wins in our conservation community and just our community by stepping up and really getting out there and doing it. So without Ray's leadership, though, I mean, it wouldn't have happened. It was a huge lift, and a lot of people along the way were wondering, why are we doing this? And but we got there, and I'm thankful we did. I'm thankful we did.
Well, I'm very excited to see how it turns out. We are pretty much wrapping things up here. We're at the end of the day, so I just want to say thank you to Mike and Ray for coming out and talking to us a little bit about what's going on with their tribe and some of the information that they can pass down to our listeners. So thank you very much for coming out today. And to all of our listeners, thank you for joining in, and enjoy the rest of your day.